the powerful Street HEMI engine was suddenly banned, surprising muscle car fans everywhere. Let's watch out for what happened behind the scenes that changed racing and muscle cars forever. Most people today have seen the word HEMI on cars or trucks made by Chrysler. Some car fans think of big engines and muscle cars when they hear that word, but only a few people know the full story of where it all began. To really understand the engine, we need to go back more than 100 years. The idea behind it came a long time before muscle cars. The name HEMI comes from the shape of the engine's combustion chamber, which is shaped like half of a ball, also called a hemisphere. This is where the engine makes power by burning fuel. Let's go even further back in time. In the year 1905, a car company from Belgium called Pipe built a 4-cylinder engine with this hemispherical chamber design. Just 2 years later, in 1907, a race car from the company Fiat used this design in the Grand Prix. During the next 10 years, other companies also tried using the same idea. For a while, fewer car makers used this idea. One reason was that making these engines cost more money. Even though they made more power, they were not easy to build or cheap to produce. So some companies stopped using the design for a while. Then came World War II. This is when the story really picks up for Chrysler. During the war, Chrysler started working on powerful engines for military vehicles. These engines used a hemispherical shape because they worked well and produced lots of power. One of the engines was a V12 engine that went into tanks. Another was a giant V16 engine made to power airplanes. That V16 engine had a name, the Hone 2220. It was built to power fighter planes, like the Republic Thunderbolt. This huge engine made 2,500 horsepower and could push a plane past 500 miles per hour in test flights. But just when it looked ready, the war ended and jet engines began to take over. So Chrysler's big fighter plane engine never made it into production. Even though the airplane engine was never used in real battles, Chrysler engineers had learned a lot from building it. The shape of the combustion chamber and the angle of the valves gave them big ideas. This knowledge would soon help make something very special for cars on the street. In the early 1950s, Chrysler finally used what they had learned in a car engine. In the year 1951, they introduced their first overhead valve V8 engine with the HEMI design. They called this engine the Firepower. This engine was powerful and smartly built. A few years later in 1955, a man named Bob Roger worked on making the engine even stronger. He added 2 4-barrel carburetors to create more power. This version went into the Chrysler 300C, which became the first American production car to claim 300 horsepower. From that point, the engine got bigger. It went from 331 cubic inches to 354, and then to 392. But by 1959, Chrysler decided to stop using that version of the engine in their regular cars. They moved to a new kind of engine design called the wedge engine. Even though this engine was gone from regular cars, it still had a home. People who raced cars on drag strips or across salt flats kept using the early engines. These engines were strong and could handle racing fuel. Even boat racers used them. So while regular drivers didn't see these engines anymore, racers loved them. Then came the early 1960s. Chrysler was going through big changes. A man named Lynn Townsend became the new president of the company. His teenage sons told him that Chrysler cars were boring compared to the ones they saw on the streets near Detroit. Townsend wanted to change that. So in October of 1961, he started a new performance group of engineers to build fast cars. This group was led by Tom Hoover, who loved hot rods. The team started building powerful wedge engines with 413 cubic inches. Then, when a racing rule limited engine size to around 427 cubic inches, they built a wedge engine with 426. But that wasn't enough. Townsend wanted to win big, so Hoover's team decided to bring back the particular engine design. They used the old cylinder heads and worked fast to make changes. They made the engine stronger, kept the special valve angles, and prepared it for tough racing. The hard work paid off. In 1964, racer Richard Petty won the Daytona 500 with this engine under the hood. The engine was called the A864. It became the beginning of a new chapter in this engine story. But not everyone liked this strong engine. Bill France, the man who ran NASCAR, saw the engine winning too often. He also worried about safety after a crash took a racer's life. At the end of the season, he made a rule that HEMI engines could not race in 1965. Chrysler's racing boss, Ronnie Householder, didn't like that. He pulled all of Chrysler's cars from NASCAR racing. Instead, they focused on other types of racing and special match races with drag cars. Meanwhile, The engineers made the engine lighter and even more ready for racing. Then someone had a big idea. What if they put the engine back into regular cars? If the engine was used in cars that people could buy, maybe the racing rules would change. Chrysler decided to go for it. Plans took shape, and finally on January 6, 1965, two Chrysler leaders named Bob Roger and Bob Cahill sent a letter asking for a version of the engine that could go into street cars. Just 6 days later, W.J. Bradley from the planning team gave a plan for what that engine would look like. Now it was time to build the engine for real. It had to be strong but also able to run every day. It had to work in all kinds of weather. And it had to run on regular gas, not race fuel. This was the beginning of the engine that would become known as the Street HEMI, rolling into showrooms. By the year 1966, this new version of the engine was ready. It was placed in all kinds of Chrysler cars, from the fancy ones to the basic models. Even the brand new Dodge Charger could be ordered with this sort of engine, changing the rules again. After seeing empty seats and no Chryslers on the track, NASCAR's Bill France changed his mind. He allowed this engine back into racing for 1966. Chrysler returned with strong cars and strong racers. Petty won again. David Pearson won his first NASCAR championship. Drag racers also had great success. Features and performance. Now let's dive into what made the Chrysler 426 engine so special, how powerful it was, and the famous cars it powered. This engine was known for its strength, speed, and power. It was truly a giant in the world of engines. To begin with, the 426 was a big engine with a size of 426 cubic inches. That means the space inside its cylinders, where fuel and air mix and burn, was very large. This gave it a lot of muscle to push the cars forward. It was a big block V8 engine, which means it had 8 cylinders arranged in a V shape, making it very powerful and able to deliver strong performance. One important thing about this engine was how much power it made. On the street version of the 426, the engine produced about 425 horsepower. Horsepower is a way to measure how strong the engine is. That is enough power to make the car go very fast and accelerate quickly. It also made about 490 pound-feet of torque. Torque is what helps a car get moving from a stop and climb hills. The high torque made the 426 HEMI perfect for many kinds of vehicles, giving them a strong punch when the driver stepped on the gas pedal. Because of its power, this engine was sometimes called the elephant engine. This nickname came from how big and heavy the engine was, but also because it was strong like an elephant. Even though it was heavy, the engine was built tough and reliable, able to handle hard driving and long races. Let's look closer at how the 426 worked on the street. The engine was built with a lower compression ratio than the racing version. This meant it was a little less aggressive, so it could run on regular gasoline and last longer in everyday driving. The compression ratio is about 10.25 to 1, which means the air and fuel mixture was squeezed before burning, but not as much as the race engine's 12.5 to 1. This change made it smoother and safer for regular cars. The Street 426 HEMI also had a different camshaft, which controls how the valves open and close in the engine. The camshaft was less aggressive, meaning the engine was easier to drive and did not need to be pushed to very high speeds to work well. It also used different intake and exhaust parts, which made the engine quieter and better for normal road use. Because of these changes, the Street 426 could be used in regular cars without much trouble. Even with these softer settings, the engine still made a strong 425 horsepower and 490 pound-feet of torque, which was amazing for a street engine at the time. The 426 was also known for how well it worked with the cars it was put into. From 1966 to 1971, many popular muscle cars used this engine. One example was the Dodge Charger, which came with the 426 engine as an option. This car was big and fast, perfect for showing off the power of the engine. The Charger RT, road track, was a favorite among muscle car fans. It was built to be both a street car and a race car, and the engine made sure it could win on both tracks. Another famous car was the Plymouth Barracuda, sometimes called the Cuda. The Cuda with the 426 engine was fast and rare. People still hunt for these cars today because they are special collector's items. The engine gave the Barracuda a quick burst of speed, making it exciting to drive. Besides these two, this engine powered other well-known cars like the Dodge Super Bee, Plymouth GTX, and Dodge Challenger. Each of these cars had their own style and fan base, but they all shared the same powerful heart, the 426 HEMI engine. Even special cars like the Dodge Charger Daytona and Plymouth Superbird, which had big wings on the back, used the 426. These cars were designed to be fast on the track and had sleek shapes to help with speed. The HEMI engine helped them reach amazing speeds and made them legends in the car world. The 426 wasn't just powerful, but also built to last. Its engine block was made to handle high pressure and stress. Chrysler made sure the block was stress-relieved, which means they treated it to prevent cracks and damage during hard driving. This made the engine strong enough for racing and street use alike. The power of the 426 also came from its torque, which helped the cars pull hard and get moving quickly. This was different from some other engines that had more horsepower but less torque. The HEMI's strong torque made it great for different types of driving, from drag racing to cruising on the highway. Because the engine was big and heavy, Chrysler worked to make some parts lighter. Some racing versions had parts made from magnesium, a lightweight metal. This helped the engine weigh less and perform better, especially in racing. The oil system was also advanced, with a dry sump design to keep oil flowing properly during high-speed turns. Though the racing versions had some of these special lightweight parts, the Street 426 HEMI was still very impressive. It was one of the best engines of its time for muscle cars. The balance of power and reliability made it a favorite for car lovers everywhere. In the late 1960s and early 1970s, owning a car with a 426 was a status symbol. These cars were rare and expensive, but they delivered amazing performance. Drivers could feel the strength of the engine from the moment they stepped on the gas. The deep, roaring sound of the V8 told everyone that something powerful was on the road. One reason the 426 was so popular is because it could be used in many different cars. From big sedans like the Dodge Coronet to sporty muscle cars like the Plymouth Roadrunner, the engine fit right in. This made it a versatile power plant for Chrysler's lineup. Besides the regular muscle cars, some luxury and sports cars even have 426. For example, the Jensen Interceptor and Jensen FF British sports cars also use the engine from 1966 to 1971. These cars combine style with power, showing how flexible the 426 could be. Even though the 426 was powerful, it was designed to be used on regular roads. Chrysler engineers made sure the engine could run well with everyday gasoline and provide smooth power without needing special treatment. This was important because not everyone wanted a race car engine in their daily driving. Homologation success. Next came homologation success. Homologation is a big word that means making enough engines or cars for the street so they can be used in racing. Back in the 1960s, racing rules said that to use an engine in NASCAR, car companies had to build at least 500 of those engines for regular people to buy and drive on the street. Chrysler met this rule by making a street version of the 426, as I mentioned before. This was a smart move because it let them use their powerful HEMI engine in official races. The Street 426 wasn't just for NASCAR. It was also important for drag racing. Drag racing is a type of race where cars go very fast in a short, straight line, usually a quarter mile. For drag racing, Chrysler also made enough 426 engines to meet the rules so the engine could compete in NHRA Superstock and other drag racing classes. This process helped the 426 engine become a legend in many types of motorsports. Talking about NASCAR racing next, the 426 was a game changer. It helped drivers win many important races in the 1960s and early 1970s. One of the most famous drivers who used the 426 was Richard Petty. People called him the King because he won so many races. He drove a Plymouth Belvedere with the 426 engine in 1966 and 1967. Petty won the Daytona 500 race 2 years in a row, which is one of the biggest races in NASCAR. Another famous NASCAR driver was Bobby Isaac. He raced a Dodge Charger Daytona with the 426 in 1969. Isaac was very successful and won the 1970 NASCAR Grand National Championship. He won 11 races that year and set a record by starting first in 20 races, which is called winning pole positions. There was also Buddy Baker, a speed legend. Baker was the first driver to go over 200 miles per hour on a closed racetrack. He did this in 1970 at the Talladega Superspeedway. Baker drove a Dodge Charger Daytona, powered by the 426. He also won big races like the Southern 500 in 1970 and the Daytona 500 in 1972, showing just how strong the engine was. These famous drivers and their cars helped the 426 build a strong reputation in NASCAR. Moving from NASCAR to drag racing, the 426 was just as dominant. Drag racing uses very fast acceleration and short bursts of speed, and the 426 was built for exactly that. In the mid-60s, Dodge and Plymouth cars with 426 HEMI engines won many national drag racing events. One of the greatest drag racers was Dick Landy. He drove a 1964 Dodge 330 with the 426 engine. Landy won the 1964 U.S. Nationals in the Superstock class and set a national record for elapsed time. Elapsed time is how fast a car finishes the race from start to finish. He kept winning many races and became one of the best drag racers of his time. Another famous drag racer was Butch Leal. Leal drove a 1968 Plymouth Barracuda, powered by the 426. In 1972, he won the Winter Nationals in the Pro Stock class. Leal competed in many NHRA and IHRA drag racing events during the 1970s and 80s. He won multiple races and set new records, showing how the 426 stayed competitive for a long time. Then there was the famous Sox and Martin team. Ronnie Sox and Buddy Martin drove a 1968 Plymouth Barracuda with the 426. They won the 1968 Superstock Nationals, beating top racers like Bill Grumpy Jenkins. Sox and Martin set multiple records and became one of the most successful drag racing teams in history. Their cars showed how the 426 was not just fast, but also reliable and powerful in drag racing. All these successes in drag racing helped make the 426 a legend. It was one of the most popular engines among racers and fans because it gave such a strong performance and won many important races. Performance. How fast was the 426 HEMI? That is a great question. When the engine was new, its street versions were really fast for the time. Cars with the 426 could run the quarter mile in about 13 to 14 seconds. The quarter mile is a race distance of 1/4 of a mile or 400 meters. These cars reach speeds up to 110 miles per hour in these races. In the 1960s and early 1970s, this was very fast for a car that anyone could buy and drive. The racing versions of this engine were even faster. They could run the quarter mile in as little as 9 seconds. 9 seconds for a quarter mile means the car was accelerating super fast from a stop and reaching speeds up to 140 miles per hour by the finish line. That was lightning fast and made the 426 HEMI-powered cars some of the quickest on the drag strip. When you think about it, the 426 was one of the fastest engines you could get from the showroom in those days. You did not have to buy a special race car to get that kind of speed. This engine made regular muscle cars powerful enough to compete in many racing types or simply enjoy fast driving on the street. Also important was how the 426 performed in real life. Besides speed, it had strong torque, which means it could pull hard and work well, even when going up hills or towing heavy loads. This made it useful for different jobs, not just racing. People liked the HEMI because it was powerful, but also dependable. Problems of engine. But like all things, the Chrysler 426 engine had some problems. Even though it was very strong and fast, it was not perfect. Let's take a look at some of the troubles people had with this engine. First of all, valve seat problems. The valve seats are the parts inside the engine where the valves close tightly to keep the air and fuel mixture inside the cylinder. Some 426 HEMI engines had valve seats that came loose. When this happens, it could cause big holes to blow in the engine block, which is very bad. Imagine a hole in the engine where it is supposed to be sealed. This made the engine stop working and was sometimes very expensive to fix. Next, there was a ticking noise. Some owners noticed a ticking sound coming from the engine, especially when it was idling, which means when the car was running but not moving. This ticking could be caused by many things, but with the 426 engine, it was sometimes because of the way the valves and other parts moved. While the noise did not always mean the engine was broken, it could be annoying and worrying for drivers. Another problem was with exhaust manifold bolts. The exhaust manifold is the part of the engine that carries exhaust gases away from the engine cylinders. On the 426 HEMI, sometimes the bolts that held the exhaust manifold in place would break. When bolts break, the manifold could come loose and cause exhaust leaks. This made the engine louder and could also reduce performance. Some engines even stalled while driving or right after refueling. Stalling means the engine suddenly stops running. This could be dangerous if it happened in traffic or on the highway. The cause of stalling was sometimes tricky to find, but it was a known issue for some 426 engines. Drivers had to be careful and get their engines checked if they noticed this problem. There was also the issue of emissions. This was very good at burning fuel, but that also meant it produced higher amounts of certain gases called oxides of nitrogen, or NOx for short. These gases are bad for the air and cause pollution. Because of the way the 426 HEMI burned fuel so efficiently and quickly, it made more of these gases than some other engines. This was a challenge for car makers who wanted to make engines cleaner while still keeping the power. But here's something interesting. Even though we call it a HEMI, the shape is not a perfect half sphere. It is actually a bit less than half. Some experts call it a semi-HEMI because the shape is a little different. Still, this shape helps the engine create strong pressure quickly, which makes the engine powerful. The hemispherical shape also lets the engine have big valves that are tilted to the side. Bigger valves mean more air and fuel can enter the engine, and more exhaust can leave, helping the engine breathe better and run stronger. The tilted valves also avoid hitting the cylinder walls and each other, which is important because if the valves hit anything, the engine can be damaged. Because of this design, the engine could have more airflow than other engines with similar size. This was one of the reasons why it was so fast and powerful. However, there were some downsides to this special design. The hemispherical combustion chambers and valve angles made the engine bigger and heavier than other engines of the same size. The extra weight and size meant the engine took up more space under the hood and made the car a little heavier. In fact, it was about 100 pounds heavier than another Chrysler engine, with the same size called the wedge engine. It was also several inches wider. This meant that fitting the HEMI engine into cars was sometimes more difficult and could affect how the car handled. Another problem with the HEMI design was the higher emissions we talked about earlier. Because the hemispherical shape caused the fuel to burn faster and hotter, it made more nitrogen oxides. Other engines with different shapes had something called a quench area that helped cool the fuel mixture and reduce these gases. The HEMI did not have this, so it caused more pollution. Still, despite the size, weight, and emissions issues, many people loved the 426 HEMI for its power and speed. Variations of engine. The engine has not only been part of Chrysler's history, there have been many variations of the HEMI engine over the years. Long before the 426, Chrysler made other engines that came in many sizes and versions. There were at least 12 different versions of early engines made for different kinds of cars and trucks. Today, the HEMI name is still used on powerful engines in Dodge and Chrysler vehicles. Modern engines have improved with better technology but keep the big power and sound that fans love. For example, in 2003, Chrysler introduced a 350 cubic inch engine, which means the engine size was about 350 cubic inches. Since then, there have been bigger and more powerful engines, including a 390 cubic inch engine used in trucks and muscle cars. Dodge, a part of Chrysler, is famous for using these particular engines in some of its fastest cars, like the Hellcat. The Hellcat had 707 horsepower when it was first made in 2015. That is a lot of power even for today's cars, but Dodge kept pushing the limits. In 2018, they made the Demon, a special car, with an engine that made 840 horsepower. The Demon could run a quarter mile in less than 10 seconds, which was faster than many supercars. Then came something even more amazing. A crate engine called the Hellefant. A crate engine is a complete engine that people can buy and put into their own cars. The Hellefant was named as a tribute to the original engine and was one of the most powerful engines you could buy from the factory. It made 1,000 horsepower and 950 pound-feet of torque. That is incredible power for an engine you can buy and put into your car without building it yourself. Even better, an updated version of the Hellefant engine was released in 2022. This new version made 1,100 horsepower, showing how far the design has come. The last big engine from Dodge was the Demon 170, released in 2023. This engine made 1,025 horsepower and 945 pound-feet of torque. It set records by running the quarter mile in 8.91 seconds and reaching 60 miles per hour in just 1.66 seconds. That made it the fastest accelerating production car in the world, and it was only beaten by electric cars or special drag racing cars. Dodge planned to make 3,000 Demon 170 cars, giving a strong and powerful farewell to the HEMI engine that started it all. So, the Chrysler 426 HEMI engine has had its share of problems, yet its unique design with hemispherical combustion chambers gave it great power and speed. Ban of engine. We've all heard that every rise has its fall, but sometimes the fall comes from insecurity and politics, not failure. Let's explore the shocking truth behind why, despite all its power and success, the legendary street engine was ultimately banned by NASCAR. This powerful engine stopped being used in cars after the 1971 model year. That was the last chance to order a car from Chrysler with the HEMI under the hood. Many reasons caused the engine to be stopped. First, it was expensive to make. It cost almost $900 extra, and that price included a stronger transmission and rear axle to handle the power. Also, new rules about pollution were about to get very strict, making it hard for the engine to meet them. On top of that, insurance companies raised the cost of muscle car insurance a lot. Together, these things meant the engine's time was up. In total, Chrysler put 10,904 HEMI 426 engines in their cars during the 6 years it was made. Today, the cars with this engine are very famous and special. They came from a racing engine that won many races on NASCAR tracks and drag strips. Because of this history and how powerful these cars are, many collectors want them. These cars have become good investments and they are still fun to drive. For example, the highest price ever paid at an auction for a car with the 426 was a 1971 Plymouth Barracuda convertible. This car is very rare. Only 7 were made with this engine that year. It sold for $3.5 million in 2014. This shows how much people value these HEMI-powered cars today. However, it was not always allowed to race everywhere. In 1965, NASCAR banned the engine. This happened because NASCAR changed its rules. The new rule said that any engine used in NASCAR must be sold to the public in regular cars. Chrysler used the 426 in their NASCAR race cars before they sold it in street cars. This made other teams complain, saying it gave Chrysler an unfair advantage. Because of this, NASCAR stopped allowing the engine in the 1965 season. This was a hard time for NASCAR fans who loved the HEMI. But for others, it meant new racing chances. Chrysler moved many of its best factory racing teams from NASCAR to drag racing instead. Meanwhile, other car makers such as Ford took over NASCAR racing. This change made NASCAR races less exciting for some people because the competition was not as strong without Chrysler's cars. At the same time, this outstanding engine was still breaking records elsewhere. For example, Bill and Bob Summers used 4 of these engines to set a new land speed record. Their car reached an average speed of 409.2 miles per hour. This beat the old record set by Mickey Thompson's car with a Pontiac engine. Also, other racers worked on supercharging the HEMI engine to make it even faster. Leroy Yarbrough drove a supercharged car to a new record lap speed of 181.8 miles per hour at Daytona. The engine was proving itself not only in regular racing, but also in speed records. Meanwhile, the American Hot Rod Association, or AHRA, welcomed the new HEMI-powered cars and their changes. However, the National Hot Rod Association, the NHRA, was stricter. They put these fast Mopar cars into a special class that made it harder to race fairly. Despite that, it continued to be a favorite among racers and fans. In other types of racing, like Indy cars and road racing, interest was growing quickly too. People watched exciting races with new kinds of cars powered by American V8 engines like the HEMI. These races brought new excitement and helped the car culture grow even more. Throughout all this engine was making its mark. It was part of many important racing stories in the 1960s and early 1970s. Though it was no longer allowed in NASCAR and stopped being made after 1971, the engine's power and history made it legendary. So, the Chrysler 426 HEMI engine was a game changer in muscle cars and racing. It faced challenges and rules that eventually ended its production, but it left behind a legacy that lives on. The cars with this engine are still some of the most prized muscle cars in the world. They remind us of a time when raw power and speed ruled the streets and the tracks. That's all for today. The story of the Street HEMI shows how power alone isn't always enough. What do you think? Was the ban fair or just fear? Let us know in the comments, like the video, and don't forget to subscribe for more car legends. See you in the next video.